years ago, I was on top of the world. I was living my best life. I had just celebrated my 4-year wedding anniversary at the beginning of 2015 with my wife. We had a beautiful and very happy daughter named Maya, who was 1 year old. I got to meet one of the most influential figures in my life, which was Richard Rohr. And I was working my way through the Bible with a congregation that I loved. And we were going through each book of the Bible, as I talked about last week. And we did this 9-year sermon series through the entire Bible with this congregation. And as a young adult pastor, we were leading the young adults through it. And as we were talking about the books and the different elements that all of spirituality brings to the fore, things were going very well. From part 1 to 15, I was just nailing it. And then part 16 happened, which was 2 John. And during 2 John, on a day in March in 2015, I very clearly and directly said, I disagree with the Bible. The church I was working at was not ready to hear those words at that point. And when you consider how Christians view the Bible today, you can understand why this would be problematic for some people, unless you've done a lot of prepped work and done your best to talk about what the Bible actually is and its role in our life today. What's interesting, though, about this particular story is that when I said I disagree with the Bible, it really kind of sent a shock through the system of the church I was working at, and I never really recovered. And a few months after that, I was eventually removed from that job, and then Paradox started. Now, this story actually has a further history with me, because back in 2010, I was also on top of the world. I had just engaged the love of my life, and we were taking engagement pictures. And about the time that this picture was taken, I was a student in seminary at La Sierra University, and I wrote a paper on 2 John. And in that paper, I just reread it this week, I wrote the words, I disagree with John. Now, at this point, you may have a question in your head, which is, what did John do to you, Craig? And why do you have this years-long vendetta against 2 John? To which I would say, I'm glad you asked. Allow me to explain. 2 John is the first part in our 9-year sermon series through the entire Bible. And the reason we are starting with this book is because I have waited 9 years since the last time I preached it to get a second shot at this thing, because I think I can do this better than the last time I did it. And so the cool thing about 2 John is it's so short, it's only 13 verses long, that we can actually read the entire book together as a congregation. And one question that I get in 2024 and hear frequently is, how do we study the Bible? What is the best way for us to engage with the Scripture? And I will tell you, for me, what I like to do is I like to take out a piece of paper while I'm reading the Bible, and I like to summarize each of the points as I go along, and I separate it by chapter and verse. Now, in 2 John, there's no chapters because it's so short, so we just need to highlight the verses and write notes along the way as to what John is saying as his letter unfolds and progresses. So, let's begin by reading 2 John, verse 1, 2, and 3. We read, from the elder, that's from John, to the chosen one and her children, whom I love in the truth, and not only I, but also all who have come to know the truth, because of the truth that lives in us and is with us forever. May grace, mercy, and peace be with you in truth and love, from God our Creator and from Jesus Christ, God's only begotten. So, these first 3 verses form a singular coherent thought, which is basically the greeting of the letter. There's not a whole lot more beyond that, other than the fact that John is trying to say we have some things in common. It's a very typical greeting. Then in verse 4, we read, it has given me great joy to find some of your children walking in the path of truth, just as we were commanded by Abba, God. Now, this is a bit of a standalone verse in this book, and so we're going to say that verse 4 is a celebration of the truth. John, in his era of misinformation, is so happy that there are other people who value what is true and what is worth celebrating that is honest. And then we get to verse 5, where John writes these words. Now, I would make this request of you, but it is not as if I were writing you some new commandment. Rather, it is a commandment we have had from the start. Let us love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to the commandments. And as you have heard from the beginning, the commandment is the way in which you should walk. So verses 5 and 6 contain a commandment, a request from John to the recipient of this letter. John says, we have a commandment which is to love one another. Then in verse 7, we're about halfway through this book now, it's here that John says, many deceitful people have gone out into the world, people who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. They are the spirit of the deceitful one. They are the Antichrist. Now, if you are reading through this like me and you're reading it on a computer, you might have a reaction like this, or this, or this, or this. Because if you're like me, you're like, wait. What was all the 6 verses before verse 7 here? The first 6 verses are all talking about how we should love one another. But then John says, but beware of the deceitful ones, because those people are the Antichrist. In other words, when we go back to our outline over here with verses 5 and 6, where it says love one another, we need to put an asterisk right there, because there are people who are deceiving us and are not doing the same thing that we are doing. And so he calls them the Antichrist. Here is finally the asterisk. I found it. There it is. We'll put love one another with an asterisk. He says these people are the Antichrist because they're leading people away from the truth. So who are these people that are leading people away from the truth? And when you look at verse 7, John tells you who they are. He says at the end here, many deceitful people have gone out into the world, people who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. Now, these are very specific people in John's mind, because John lives in a real historical context. Now, scholars will say that this is most likely referring to a guy and his disciples, although we don't know if he's talking about one person or a group of people. The guy that he's referring to is a man named Cerinthus. Let me hear you say Cerinthus this morning. Now, Cerinthus was a guy who believed in the gospel message of Jesus Christ, but he believed some things different than John. Namely, he didn't believe in a virgin birth. He said that Jesus was born the old-fashioned biological way, and Jesus grew up as a normal human being. Nothing extraordinary about him. He committed sins. He did things that were wrong. And then, when Jesus decided he would be baptized, the Spirit of God descended from heaven like a dove directly onto the body of Jesus. It was at that point that God took over the controls of this body and walked around as the incarnate God, completely separating the body from the previous person that was Jesus. Then there was this moment where all of a sudden, after going around as a year, like where Jesus was the embodiment of who God was, once it came time for Jesus to be crucified, right before the nails hit, God evacuated the body, because God, according to Cerinthus, doesn't suffer at all, and went back up into heaven, and it was a human being that died on the cross, not God incarnate, because God can't die, Cerinthus said. This is called Gnosticism. Can I hear you say Gnosticism this morning? And Cerinthus was a leader of proto-Gnosticism, and it's the idea that Jesus was not human at all when he was the incarnation of God. And so John has heard about Cerinthus' teaching. He's probably lost some people in his church to Cerinthus' teaching, and he hears about all of these different things that Cerinthus is teaching, and he says there's deceivers out there. They're people who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh, people who do not acknowledge Jesus' humanity. So when we look at our outline, we have the greeting, celebrate truth, love one another with an asterisk. The asterisk is revealed in verse 7, and the asterisk is accept the Gnostics. Don't love them. You can love everyone else, but just don't love the Gnostics. John goes on to write, look out that you yourselves do not lose what you have worked for. You must receive your reward in full. In other words, if you hang out with the Gnostics, you might not make it into heaven. So verse 8 summary is basically, save yourself. Be warned. You could lose eternal life if you make friends with those people. John goes on to say, those who are so progressive that they do not remain rooted in the teaching of Christ do not possess God, while those who remain rooted in the teaching possess both Abba God and the only begotten. Any who come to your house without its doctrine are not to be welcomed. Don't even greet them, for whoever greets them shares in their evil work. So John says, show the Gnostics the door. Better yet, don't even let them in the door. Slam the door in their face. Your eternal destiny is at stake. And then in verse 12, John writes, "There are many things I have to tell you, but I choose not to use paper and ink. Rather, I choose to visit you and talk to you personally so that our joy may be complete. The children of your chosen sisters send you their greetings." So verse 12 and 13 is simply a farewell. Now, this is an important book of the Bible because it contains a contradictory tone, right? Which is it's all about love and goodness in the beginning, and then all about heresy, lies, and hellfire in the end, right? And to complicate things, or more likely to enhance things, there's actually a story that is deep in the annals of church history, and it's a story that is told by a man named Polycarp. Let me hear you say Polycarp this morning. Polycarp was a disciple of John, and Polycarp told a story about John at a time that they went to a Roman bathhouse. And the story was so moving to a Dutch artist named Jan Lyken that he actually engraved it and made an art piece about it. And the story goes like this. John and Polycarp and the other disciples walked into a bathhouse, and they were enjoying a bath like you do. And then all of a sudden, wouldn't you know it, in walks Cerinthus to the same bathhouse. And John becomes quiet. And then all of a sudden, John stands up, turns to his disciples, and says, "Let us fly, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is inside." John says to his disciples, "That's a bad man. God may crumble this bathhouse. We don't want to be collateral damage. Let's get out of here." And what's fascinating is, first of all, the bathhouse didn't crumble. Second, is the fact that John turns to his disciples and says, "We have to get out of here." This story is the embodiment of 2 John. Hey, I love my disciples. We're all cool. We're all groovy. We're all happy to be together. Oh, there's Cerinthus. Let's leave. And what's important to understand about the thesis of 2 John is that John teaches us that the greatest testimony you can give is to extravagantly love the people who are just like you. And it's logical, right? John's got Christianity to protect here. We're talking about the humanity of Jesus Christ. This is an important doctrine. And John knows that this guy is undermining him every turn he makes. And so to protect the good news of Jesus Christ, John has to avoid him. John has to tell his disciples to avoid him entirely and condemn him and even call Cerinthus the Antichrist. And so logically, all of John's argument makes sense. There's just one problem. And that problem happened 7 decades before John wrote his letter. That problem takes place on a hillside of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus Christ is delivering the Sermon on the Mount to other peasants who are oppressed by the Roman Empire, just like Jesus is. And about a third of the way through this sermon, Jesus looks at all of these people who are hurting, who have been oppressed, who have been taxed, and he says to them these words, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I tell you that you should love your enemies and pray for your persecutors." And then he says, "This will prove that you are children of God." Not how you pray for them or anything, how well you pray for them and how much you care for them. This will prove that you are children of God. Jesus goes on to say, "For God makes the sun rise on bad and good alike." The sun is a blessing, Jesus says. God doesn't put this cosmic hand in front of parts of the sun to block the sun from those who do evil. God gives the sun freely as an act of love. Jesus goes on to say, God's rain falls on the just and the unjust. Rain is received by people who do not deserve it because God is love. Jesus goes on to say, if you love those who love you, what merit is there in that? After all, Jesus says, don't tax collectors do as much? And you may wonder, what does Jesus have against the IRS? The answer is, the tax collectors of Jesus' day sold out their friends and family for profit at the expense or at the command of the Roman Empire. And so for a tax collector, you just have to imagine somebody there that you consider to be selling out the soul of a nation. I know it's hard to think of anybody right now, but just imagine that's who Jesus is talking about, right? Jesus says, you think it's all cool that you love people that are like-minded than you? Tax collectors do the same. There's no merit in that. Jesus goes on to say, and if you greet only your sisters and brothers, what is so praiseworthy about that? Don't Gentiles do as much? Don't the non-religious, the people who say, I don't really follow God, they can do that baseline. There is a greater love than even that. And so Jesus, on a hillside next to the Sea of Galilee, teaches a rather difficult thing about the ways of God. You see, Jesus teaches us that the greatest testimony you can give is to extravagantly love the people who are not like you, which is very different than John and his dripping towel leaving this bathhouse as he proclaims to the world through 2 John that the greatest testimony you can give is to extravagantly love the people who are like you and shun the people who are not. 9 years ago, I saw this contrast, and I stood up in front of a group, and I thought, okay, that's the Son of God. That's just a guy. Let's err on the side of the Son of God. And so I said, I disagree with the Bible, and things changed from that moment forward. Well, it's 2024. And I look back at this guy with some love and some understanding, and I want to validate him. I still disagree with the Bible to this day. However, I would probably say things a little bit differently. It is more than fine to disagree with the Bible. You have to disagree with the Bible. And if you are telling me you don't disagree with any word in the Bible, please join us for the next 9 years, because I will happily show you where you disagree with the Bible. There is so much to disagree with that the only way to agree with everything is to never read it. And so what I would say differently, while I still think that this is true, I still disagree with 2 John. What I would say differently is this. I would say in Matthew, Jesus directly contradicts John. And while in 2015 I would have told you, so let's just side with Jesus and move on, I found that the contradictions in Scripture are actually the most valuable parts, because that's where the humanity really starts to come through. In fact, the contradictions are our greatest teachers. So I would tell you this morning, in Matthew, Jesus directly contradicts John, but this contradiction can teach us how to grow in love for our enemies. After all, let's consider John and what he was standing for and what he was trying to do. I can empathize with John because when I think about all the sermons I've given and all the conversations I've had and what I believe in, I really value the humanity of Christ. If you've heard me preach, you've probably heard me preach way too much on the humanity of Christ and probably not enough on the divinity of Christ, right? I love talking about what it means for a God to suffer alongside us, something that Cerinthus just wanted to completely do away with. And so I point this out because while I've disagreed with John in the past, I can now say that John and I, we have the same enemies. This is a sacred belief of mine that Jesus was fully human, that Jesus was the Son of God and at the same time fully human. And so we're holding the same thing close to our heart. And then I would go on to say, and while I disagree with John, I am grateful, I am thrilled, I am elated it's in the Bible. You know why? Because the combination of Jesus' teaching and John's teaching dares to ask us a question when they're paired together. You see, 2 John asks all of us if there are limits on the enemies we love. Are there enemies that Jesus said, oh yeah, not them, I wasn't talking about them? Are there limits when Jesus says, love your enemies, that you say, well, I can't love them, and Jesus would say, oh, you're right, they're really bad? 2 John asks you to consider, is there something that someone can do that is so bad that Jesus would say they are not to be loved in any circumstance? Which brings us to Jesus Christ. Now, John, we believe, the person who wrote 2 John, was the same as the disciple who followed Jesus. And what's fascinating about this is we often like to think of people as like really close to God or not so close to God. You can't get much closer to God than John, right, in the Christian tradition. He followed Jesus around for at least a year, probably 3, and heard Jesus teach firsthand and saw the miracles with his own eyes, and then saw the resurrected Christ. And then he got to write not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 books of the Bible. He's a super Christian, right? However, what it teaches us is that you can be the best kind of Christian and still miss the point entirely, right? So if you're here sitting thinking to yourself, oh, well, I love my enemies, I'm a Christian. Bro, you can't do better than John. You cannot be a better Christian than John. So this book, combined with Jesus' teaching, invites all of us to look inward and say, who are the enemies I've written off? Who are the ones that I've said are beyond redemption? Who are the ones who I have said I don't need to love them? And when you compare this story with who Jesus was and what Jesus taught, I like to imagine this same story happening at another bathhouse, a few decades before this event happened, where it's not John and his disciples, but it's Jesus and his disciples. And imagine there is someone that is opposed to Jesus, like a tax collector. And if this tax collector came into the bathhouse, do you think that Jesus would stand up and say, these people are evil, we got to get out of here? Of course not, because Jesus spent his time on this earth getting dinner with tax collectors, the same people who sold out the soul of his nation, and it made people furious. So when you consider this bathhouse with the bathhouse we talked about, this bathhouse for Jesus is the path, is a path and a way of miraculous love. Because what Jesus is teaching here is Jesus is saying, while it may sound cool to walk on water, or it may sound cool to turn water into wine, the real miracle is learning how to love someone who is entirely unlovable, is learning how to forgive someone who doesn't deserve it. This is the way of miraculous love, to be able to stay in the hot tub and engage rather than saying, let's take our stuff and leave. So this is the way of miraculous love. This is the way of self-preservation, right? And when we consider that, there is this path that unfolds before all of us as Christians when we come across our enemies. Do we want to take the path of miraculous love or the path of self-preservation? Another way to ask this is to ask yourself, do you want justification to shun your enemies, or do you want to learn how to grow in love for your enemies? And what's interesting about the way Jesus teaches about how we should love our enemies is he says, look, any group can give you this. You can join a political party, you can be a tax collector, you can sell out the soul of a nation, and you will find justification to push your enemies aside. But I'm offering you something different. This path is where Jesus Christ leads. And for all my atheist and agnostic friends this morning, I would define this as, this is the path where the beauty of humanity lives. This is the path where the beauty of humanity lies. This is where a life worth living is found. Plus, when you consider this story and all that it entails, this is the path that allows enemies to still have power over you, right? After all, let's imagine that Polycarp loves going to the Roman bathhouse. And he sits down and he relaxes, and 5 minutes into his bath, John says, get up, we're leaving, Cerinthus is here. And Polycarp's like, but I want to take a bath. Their behavior is dependent on what their enemy is doing. They're not free. They're allowing the enemy to dictate what they do. And so this morning, a question all of us should be asking is, which path do I want to take going forward? Do I want the path of self-preservation, or do I want the path of miraculous love? And if you're hearing all of this and you're thinking to yourself, sounds really hard given our current context, I would tell you it is. In fact, I would say it is the hardest thing to do in all of the Christian tradition. There is nothing harder than learning how to love the unlovable. And it's here that you may say, so then, that's great, but how do you do it? How do we love our enemies? And I want to give you a couple things that I've learned along the way about how to love my enemies, because I've made a few in my day. I'm sure you've made a few. And I point that out because Jesus doesn't say, hey, if you follow me, you won't have any enemies. Jesus says you're going to have enemies. How you relate to them is your testimony. So, how do we love our enemies, the people who in our lives are just unlovable? These steps aren't really linear. Steps may be the wrong term. They're phases, whatever you want to call them. They're elements that compose what it means to love our enemies. I want to begin by starting with faith. I think faith is an essential part for learning how to love your enemies. Now, we often think of faith as the ability to believe ridiculous things. It's a terrible definition of faith. Faith is what one trusts about the character of God. So if you believe that God would respond to violence and hatred with love, and you step out in faith trusting that, you then, my friend, are a person of great faith. Atheists, agnostics, if you're hearing this, you're thinking, well, you left me behind. I would say that a person of great faith, even without faith, is someone who trusts something good about the nature of humanity. What do you trust about humanity and the way to live? And if that leads you to trust love in the face of fear and violence, you are a person of great faith or philosophy, whatever you prefer. So faith is an essential part because when you say, I'm going to try to love my enemy rather than choosing violence or condemnation or anger or exclusion, you are trusting something that is counterintuitive. The second element to learning how to love our enemies is the element of prayer. You see, prayer for me is not just talking to God with a wish list. Prayer is an inward journey about how I can become a more loving person. It's an inward journey where I can be honest with myself. Some people would call prayer self-reflection or meditation or contemplation. For me, the greatest prayers are the times when I can journey inward and try to listen to where love is leading me, where God is leading me in the near future. And you need this time because it allows you to be honest with yourself as to where you're hurting, where you're angry, where you're upset. And those feelings need to be acknowledged because they are real and they will wear on you. Which brings us to the third part of how we love our enemies, lament. Lament. You need to be able to express those feelings once you get in touch with them. This is why I go to therapy on a regular basis. This is why several people here go to therapy on a regular basis. And this is why several of us gathered last night to join each other in a service of lamentation, because a lot of us felt like we were honest with ourselves and knew that we were grieving, knew that we were having heartache. And so last night, if anyone felt heartache from the election, they showed up and they shared what was in their heart. And that's necessary for you to move on so that you can love your enemies. If you skip over faith or prayer or lament and just try to dive right into it, you will always end up running over yourself. Now, these may happen in this order. It may be a different order. You may bounce back and forth. These things all go hand in hand at some point in some way to lead you forward. And I wanted to draw a big line underneath lament for this reason. Once you've spent enough time in one of these three elements or all three together, there's this moment where you say, okay, I'm ready to change going forward. I think about my therapy sessions and the enemies I've talked to about in my therapy sessions. I can very vividly remember when we were talking about this one enemy, there was this moment I turned to my therapist and said, I just want to be less angry. And it's like her posture changed toward me. And she said, okay, are you really wanting to be less angry? I said, yes, how do I do that? And she said a word that I'm still upset about today. She said, Craig, the only path out is through empathy. And if I'm saying this and it sounds like it's easy for me today, I want you to know that when she told me that, I went flat out on the couch. I put my hands over my face and said, I don't want to do that. Please don't make me do that. She said, we'll try again next week. But she was right. She was right. It worked. It wasn't easy. She worked with me to try to find even the smallest shred of empathy I could find for the person that I was having a hard time with, right? She tried so hard. She's like, can you just say their job is hard? No. Can you just say it would have been hard to have been raised in their family? No. What can you say? You can say like, the commute to their work's a long ways. She's like, it's a start, Craig. And then you can grow in empathy, and you never grow in empathy to the point where you justify someone else hurting you. That's very different. But if you can even just get small shreds of empathy, then at that point you can start to take the journey toward loving our enemies. Is it easy? No. Is it fun? No. Is it the life worth living? I believe it is. Now the next step needs an asterisk next to it. It's confession. I put an asterisk because the asterisk is if needed. There are some things that happen to you you do not have to apologize for. There are some things that are completely the fault of the other person. But through lament and prayer and faith and empathy, it should trigger an inward journey in which you say, is there anything I can say I'm sorry for? And as my great friend Kim tells me all the time, always own what's yours and discard what's not. Is there anything you can say you're sorry for? Even if it's something small. Because if so, maybe that person needs to hear it. Maybe that person won't listen to you anymore, but if you can at least vocalize it out loud and know you would do something differently. So if confession is needed, then that's the time to do it. And then after empathy and confession, the next solution or the next element, the next step is action. What is it that you actually care about? Do you care about making other people's lives better? Great. Is there somebody trying to prevent other lives from getting better? Yes. Don't worry about them all the time. Focus on the people you are helping. That is how I have found the best way is to love our enemies. And this is a difficult journey, particularly in 2024, right? And when we consider that we're just a few days away from election, there's not a whole lot of people on either side that really want to do this, right? And I don't know if you know this, but I'm just a regular guy. I'm not any closer to God than any of you. I have no curtain that I go behind where I hear the voice of God. It doesn't exist. I'm just one of you. And I don't want to do this either. But guess what? It's not what pastors are. And the best person I've heard describe this is a pastor from San Francisco. She's a Lutheran minister. Her name's Nadia Bowles-Weber. And she talks about how everyone thinks that they need to look at the pastor because they're closer to God than everybody else. She's like, it's not true. Instead, the pastors are the one who feel like they need to finally do something after they've gone through spiral after spiral. And then after they've gone through those things, they finally stand up and they say, oh, screw it, I'll go first. So this morning, I would like to tell all of you, screw it, I'm going to go first. We had an election just a few days ago. If you do not know me, I like being very upfront with my politics. I don't want you to spend the rest of the sermon guessing how I voted. However, when I tell you, I don't want you to tune me out because I think I'm going to say some things you're not used to hearing. I am a registered Democrat. I voted for Kamala Harris. I have now not voted for Donald Trump for 10 years. And it's been a bit of a surreal experiencing the fact that this continues to go on and goes on. And I want to start this morning by saying to any people who voted for Donald Trump, I was wrong. On Tuesday morning, if you would have told me that Donald Trump will win the popular vote, I would have said to you, there's no way that will ever happen. I was wrong. I still would vote for Kamala Harris next week, but I am stunned, still stunned 5 days later, that Donald Trump won the popular vote. And so I want to admit that I was the one who was out of touch with the American people. I was the one who was kind of living aloof, and I understand that. Now, I do think I'm in touch with politics and people in Southern California, and I do understand that, but I really feel like I am out of touch with a lot of what Americans want. And so I do want to listen more, and I am taking steps to listen more because I do want to be a pastor for everyone and not just people who vote the same as me. I also want to say that binary politics are so hard. And they're hard because if you feel like the Biden administration did a really bad job, your only viable way to participate in democracy and make a change was to vote for Donald Trump. And I know there's third-party candidates. We all knew they weren't going to win. So if you're like, we got to change this administration and the people who are at the top, That's the only way, and that's the problem and the failures of a two-party system. And I get that. I think it needs to change. And binary politics is like programmed to make things as divisive as possible. And when you add that with social media and all the algorithms, things get really wonky really quick, right? And when I consider all of those things, I just want us to start talking at the point where it's like, we are living in an era where there's these two parties, and we have this idea that you stand for all the things that these people are, when in reality, you're just trying to make changes with votes. Now, of course, there are people who are really angry and are fighting against human rights, right? We have to pay attention to those. We will always defend with human rights. We will always stand on the side of the oppressed. But this is a hard situation that all of us are in. And when I think about all of the things that have happened in the last couple of days, I've had a real moment of reflection, which leads me to one last thing I want to say to try to take this first step in learning how to love people who are not like me. Last night, we had this event called Grieving Together. And we had this because on Wednesday, after the election results were called, I received several distressed texts and calls and people who were just as confused as I was, and I was overwhelmed by it. And so Jasmine and I sat down and we started asking what could we do, and we tried to meet people in their grief and where they were. And so we planned this event, and it was beautiful, and it was wonderful, and it was healing for so many of us, and we still have our ache and our grief, but we know we're not alone, right? As you can imagine, when we posted this online, there were some people who had some questions, right? And the questions went something like this. If you're going to hold a party for people to grieve together, are you going to hold a party for us to celebrate together? The answer is no, absolutely not. And you may ask why, and the reason is very simple. Your party is taking place over the next 4 years, so give us this one. However, they asked well, would you be willing to host a same party if the results of the election were flipped? And that was a good question. It was a really good question because I think back to 4 years ago and whether or not I would have held something like this for people who voted for Donald Trump when he lost. And I can honestly say this morning that the answer is no. I would not have done it. Which basically makes me John at the bathhouse, right? And the reason I point this out is because going forward, I look back at 2020 when Trump lost. No one reached out to me. No one said they were distressed. And when I look back at that time, I think about the people who have voted for Trump in our congregation, and I think, I probably did things in my life where they would have been uncomfortable to reach out to me and say they were hurting. And for that, I want to say I am sorry. I do want to be a pastor for people, no matter how they vote. And I want you to know that going forward, we will do this in the future for whatever group loses. And while I may not necessarily be grieving and lamenting with you, if you want me to sit in your grief with you, I will sit in your grief, and you do not need to be afraid of judgment. So allow me to be the first to invite you to an event 4 years from now, Grieving Together 2, November 10, 2028. Whoever wins, whoever loses, this will happen. We're not going to hold a party for the other side because their party happens over the next 4 years. And not everyone has to be there. It's only for people who feel heartache. And if you're willing to sit in grief with me and you feel like it would be helpful, I want to be your pastor that would be willing to do that. I do not want to treat you differently because you believe something different than me or because you vote differently than me. And while that's one step, I would encourage all of us to think about who Jesus Christ was. And you still may be in the in the faith and empathy and lament stage. Stay there as long as you need. You have to be able to express those things honestly. But when you say to yourself, I think it's time to start just with one tiny step, I will tell you, I think that is a life that is worth living, no matter how daunting, how terrifying, how disorienting that may be. We are called as Christians to respond to fear, hatred, and vitriol with love. And if we lose that, we have lost the path of Jesus. My friends, may you make space to grieve and lament without restraint. May you grow in empathy and love for your enemies. May you confess all that you feel needs to be confessed. And may you take action and stand for justice and righteousness. And may you see and embrace the image of Christ in everyone you meet, even the people who are not like you. Amen.